Hello and welcome to LawPod. I'm Dr. Amanda Kramer, and I'm joined today by Professor Justin Piché from the University of Ottawa. Thank you so much for joining us, Justin. We want to talk about a book that you just published. Maybe we can start off with a bit of a chat about what the book is about.
Right. So How to Abolish Prisons, Lessons from the Movement Against Imprisonment is a book based on conversations that we had with abolitionist organizers in both Canada and the United States. Those conversations actually happened almost a decade ago in 2015 and 2016. And basically what we've done with the book and with these conversations that we've had is looking at what kinds of objectives abolitionists are pursuing while they work towards decarceral futures. How do they do the work? What kinds of pathways do they privilege in terms of how to get to a world without prisons? How do they engage in movement building? How do they organize and structure their organizations to sustain the fight? And some of the contradictions, tensions, challenges that work, that organizing has, and what winning looks like. So I've kind of just done a bit of a summary of the chapters of the book. I think it gives folks a sense of not so much the question about why prison abolition, but rather the how. That's what this book does, because a lot of, I think, ink over the years has been spilled on, why do we need to get rid of human caging? What are the alternatives to imprisonment? But there hasn't been as much written on what abolitionist politics means in terms of praxis. And so, often folks think that prison abolition is impractical. They think it's utopian. But, the groups that we've spoken to in Canada and the United States actually show very clearly that prison abolition is practical. They're making it real in struggles day in and day out. And many of them have been doing it for decades, and it's very tangible in terms of stopping the growth of the system, of getting people diverted from prison or getting people who are out decarcerated, and also building communities that can respond to conflicts and harms in different ways. And so, that's a bit about what the book is about and why we wrote it.
Thank you. So maybe we could backtrack a little bit and you could talk to us about why you think that prisons exist in the first place. And then we can maybe talk a little bit more about abolition.
Okay, why do prisons exist? Historically, the modern prison emerges as a so-called more progressive or humane form of punishment to displace capital and corporal punishment, right? And that emerges alongside the rise of capitalism and other structures of oppression that we're still living with today. And, I think when we look at the role of imprisonment in Western societies in particular, its role is, from my perspective as a Marxist scholar, it's about basically finding ways to discipline labor. Number one, finding ways to control and subjugate people that are pushed to the margins by not just capitalism, but colonialism, heteropatriarchy, and other oppressive structures that exist. So I guess what I would say is that imprisonment exists to separate, to further disempower folks, and to keep them under control, while also, I guess in the current context that we find ourselves in, finding ways to make money off of their incarceration as well, whether we're talking about the erection of new prisons and public-private partnerships, for instance, that exist in Canada and elsewhere around the design, construction, financing, and maintenance of the prisons, whether we're talking about the goods and services that exist in those prison spaces that are largely privatized, security equipment, and so on. It's big money. There's other reasons, of course, why we incarcerate folks, but certainly from my perspective, the prison industrial complex is a significant driver of human caging.
And you maybe alluded to this already in talking about the systems of oppression, but why do you think that we need to abolish prisons?
Well, I think if there's any person that is deprived of their liberty, our liberation is tied to theirs. And so we can first we can think about all the social issues that aren't dealt with when we throw someone in a concrete cell, right? So for instance, in the Canadian context, I don't think we can talk about incarceration without noting that Indigenous people are mass incarcerated. Like the incarceration rate in Canada is roughly 100 to 120 per capita on any given year. And it's been like that since the end of the Second World War. The incarceration rate for Indigenous peoples in Canada is over 900 per 100,000 people, right? And so I think when we understand that, we need to understand that we as a society haven't dealt with the legacies, the colonial legacy that we have, the legacy of genocide of Indigenous peoples, that's happened through the Indian Act, the reserve system, residential schools, 60 scoop mass adoption that has, caused intergenerational harm and trauma that one has disorganized Indigenous communities and displaced them from their languages, their cultures, spiritualities, and ways of relating to each other. And that has certainly caused, some violence in those communities that leads to incarceration, but also, the fact that policing and imprisonment treats Indigenous peoples differently at every single stage of the punitive injustice process, right? So whether we're talking about whether or not they get charged, whether or not they go before the courts, whether or not they get convicted, what kind of sentence do they get, what kind of security classification they get placed in, how do they move through the system, how do they get out, how do they get pulled back in through parole violations, every single choke point, they're treated differently. So I think if we want to move towards a decolonial future, it necessarily involves a decarceral one. And that's just like one example. If we understand, for instance, in Ontario, that a quarter of imprisoned people at the provincial level are cycling from homelessness to incarceration and vice versa, I think we need to understand that we have a housing problem, right? And we could talk about other issues that don't get dealt with when we lock people up. And so if anyone were to enter a prison and meet with imprisoned people and hear the kinds of challenges they're facing, you realize very quickly that the prison operates like Angela Davis says it does in her book, Our Prison's Obsolete. It operates like a panacea to try and address all the shortcomings and all the forms of marginalization that we see in society. And so if we understand that the current world in which we live is one where a lot of folks are harmed by that way of being, are injured by it, maimed by it, sometimes killed by it, we need to do what, Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about, is to try and change everything. And prison abolition is a small part of that. We need to build a different world if we're going to actually meaningfully reduce violence, and that includes state violence, which incarceration is one example of. So, we don't get too much into the book about why to abolish prisons. We do make an argument for it, I guess, in the opening chapter, but we really focus on the practice. How are people doing it, and what kinds of struggles are they going through? How do they set themselves up for success? What success means, that kind of thing.
And you've been doing some of that practical work yourself. Maybe you can tell us some of the practical steps that you've been taking outside of just writing about these things to try to move towards an abolitionist future.
Right. Okay. So I guess one of the groups that I've been part of, it's not a group we actually talk too much about in the book. We didn't interview my own group for this, but part of the Criminalization and Punishment Education Project. It was set up in 2012. It's a group of, students, professors who are working with people with lived expertise of criminalization and punishment. So either people that have been criminalized themselves or their loved ones, and other concerned members of the community. And basically we try to do organizing that reduces the use and harms of policing and imprisonment, and trying at the same time, in addition to kind of reforms to chip away at the power of the system, also work towards decarceral futures by doing things like engaging in police defunding campaigns, or what I do most of my work for with CPEP is working on campaigns to stop prisons from being built. So we had our NOPE campaign, No Ottawa Prison Expansion campaign, that stopped the construction of a $1 billion jail in Ottawa. The province, in response to that, took a bit of time, and then they came back with a new configuration of prison expansion in Eastern Ontario, which includes a 235-bed prison that they want to build in Kemptville at the old Kemptville Agricultural College that was shut down in 2014 under neoliberal restructuring and cost cutting at the provincial level and by Guelph University. And basically, they want to put this prison there that has floodplain, that has a Rideau River watershed creek, that has 178 acres of arable farmland. They want to plop a prison on top of all of that in a context of food insecurity and climate catastrophe. I mean, I'm against prison building, period, but like if you were going to build a prison, this would be like the worst place to build it. It makes absolutely no sense, whether you're an abolitionist or a reformer. Anyway, so they're doing that, and they're also building several other smaller, or they want to build several other smaller facilities in Napanee. So we've gone from one 725-bed $1 billion prison to several smaller projects that we're now trying to fight through the coalition against the proposed prison. It's a group of folks based in Kemptville that are saying not just not in my backyard, they're saying not in any backyard. So we're trying to get this prison construction moratorium going, and we've been at it for 4 years. Originally, the prison was actually supposed to start construction in 2024, so there'd be shovels in the ground by now, had we not organized 4 years ago against this. They still haven't moved. We've got them locked up in court right now to try and stop the project through legal means. We'll see if that works. And then, they now plan to build or to open that prison if they manage to get it built, which we don't think they will, instead of 2027, 2031. So our organizing has actually pushed that project further away, which we will continue to do until we win and until such time that a new provincial government will make different choices with how to spend money, instead of, in this case, of $500 million for the 235-bed Kemptville prison and then millions more for these other facilities that I talked about. So that's kind of what CPEP is up to in terms of our organizing. And certainly I think when we talk about moratorium organizing, which is one of the key pathways to abolition that we talk about in this book, we understand, like the authors of Instead of Prisons in 1976 understood, that you can't achieve an abolitionist future when the punitive injustice system or the prisons or the capacity to imprison is expanding. So that's why CPEP does moratorium work, is like, we've got to stop the growth. And then once we stop the growth, we got to find a way to chip away at this system. And so that's just a bit about what we do. And certainly there's a lot of great work that we get at in the book that speaks to some of the moratorium organizing that's happening, for instance, in California, that Critical Resistance is involved in, that we interviewed for the book, and other stuff, I guess.
Great. And part of the reason why you're here is to launch the Irish Penal Abolition Network. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is and what the network aims to do?
Yeah, I mean, when Gillian McNoll and Keith Adams asked me to participate in the panel, I'm like, well, why do you want to bring someone from Canada to talk about that? But they mentioned that essentially there's prison construction planned for the island of Ireland. And basically, they just wanted me to talk about the role that penal reform plays in prison expansion and some of the work that CPEP has done to stop prisons from being built. So my understanding of the network is basically it's a network that's oriented towards abolishing prisons, certainly, and trying to stop, in the immediate term, prison construction, do other kinds of organizing as well around prison conditions and trying to find ways to make imprisonment less harmful while there's still incarceration going on. So yeah, I was happy to share the work or the experience that CPEP has had in terms of stopping prisons from being built, and like also thinking about like how is it that these prisons, they emerge usually from places where there's crowding, where the conditions of confinement are said to be poor, where the programming is said not to be current with the current needs of prison populations. And it's like a story, a cyclical story that we hear when new prisons are built, and then when they want to close them and replace them with bigger ones, that same story gets told over and over again. So, I talked a bit about the history of prison construction in Ottawa, how the Carleton County Jail, which was opened in I don't want to say 1862, it closed in 1972 when it was replaced by the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center. When the Carleton County Jail opened in 1862, it replaced a smaller facility that said to have bad conditions of confinement, that's said to be harmful to prisoners. When OCDC replaced the Carleton County Jail, same kind of rhetoric, except when OCDC emerged in 1972, rehabilitation was more on the minds of government at that point. And so they saw OCDC as, going to quote the minister Grossman from the time, that's his name, Alan Grossman. He said that OCDC and other jails that were built like it at the time were going to be rehabilitation units, and I quote, right? And also places where they would open, and this is his words again, the broad horizons to try and transform the lives of imprisoned people, And so that kind of flowery rhetoric we heard again in 2017. And I think one of the things that we talked about in that panel, Phil Scraton talked about this, Mo Mansfield talked about this as well, is that when these prisons get built, it often happens in this context where, and Keith Adams and Gillian McNall also said this, that like, it's like ahistorical, like, it's like people forgot history. It's as if we've never heard that there was a prison crowding problem before that couldn't be solved by building new cages. So, like, I think abolitionist analyses that look into the long history of human caging, including prison construction, I think we're better equipped to understand current developments in the prison industrial complex and to not just contextualize it, but use the past to inform our actions in the present to try and stop things, counter discourses, build power with people, organize, and win. And, I think this is part of this book too, and how to abolish prisons. We have a chapter on victories. Victories can look like things such as survival. When people survive this system, this death-making system that injures, maims, and kills people, that's a win. When a new cage doesn't get built, that's a win. I think folks who get the book, who are able to benefit from the insights of the organizers that we interviewed, and I learned a lot doing this. Like, I'm an organizer, and reading this book, I'm like, oh, fuck, I'm doing not a lot of good things here in terms of how I organize things and work in my organization. With CPEP, we can do better, organize better, and win. Because I'm here to fucking win. I'm not here to, do organizing to just do it. It's, if you're going to put in the work, you want to get outcomes. And I think this book can help folks in that direction, whether they're, new to organizing or longstanding organizers. I learn something new every time that I read a chapter from it. And I hope others will see it if they read the book in a similar way, that it's a useful organizing tool, because that's why we wrote it, is to make this way of doing politics practical, or seem practical when it's frequently accused of being impractical, and hopefully helping build the movement further, because obviously we're still in an expansionary context, I think, in many places in the world anyways. We're losing a lot too, I'd say, in different ways. So anytime we have the space to reflect on the limits and the possibilities of what we're doing and how we can do things better, it's a good thing. So hopefully readers will agree.
And you've touched on, some of the strategies that you've engaged in or other organizations have engaged in to move towards an abolitionist future. Are there any other strategies that you want to highlight? Or maybe do you want to move towards kind of telling us what you think an abolitionist future looks like.
Right. I mean, so the different kinds of pathways to organizing, we've obviously talked about anti-expansion efforts quite a bit, but I think there's, I believe, 4 other pathways that we talk about in the second chapter of the book. So there's, groups like Black and Pink and the Prisoner Correspondence Project that work in solidarity with imprisoned people through corresponding with them to build relationships across prison walls. So they're correspondence projects. And also to identify issues of immediate concern to, in their case, trans prisoners, like gaining access to gender-affirming healthcare while working towards the ultimate goal of liberation. So there's folks that do that kind of work, the solidarity work, trying to put imprisoned people in a better position to fight so that they themselves can lead the movement and be healthy enough, have enough resources to be able to actually marshal their unique insights that they have. I mean, they know better than anyone on the outside what is needed in their lives and what's needed behind bars. So that work's important. We talk about art and cultural work as well. Groups like the Termite Collective, which is like a group of parolees and a group of folks that are inside that engage in political education on both sides of the walls through art and cultural work, passing on knowledge through like writing plays and things like that. I think in this struggle, we can't forget that there are human beings that are being caged, right? Even though we're saying we need to get rid of these cages and do the kinds of work that I've described before, there's people that are day in, day out living draconian conditions of confinement in, institutions that are both old and new. And they need to be freed. And that happens through diversion and decarceration efforts. And that happens through legal advocacy, right? So we interviewed groups like Justice Now, who actually do, rebellious lawyering to try and figure out ways to reduce the prison population. There's also, public policy work, policy advocacy that folks do, to try and increase the kinds of ways that people can be steered away from imprisonment and pulled out of imprisonment. So we interviewed the Chicago Community Bond Fund that raises money for cash bail, but they also work towards reforming to get rid of cash bail in Illinois, and they succeeded in that. And that happened through policy advocacy. And I think what these different pathways highlight is that prison abolition is a praxis, and you can do this work in various different ways to weaken the structure of the prison industrial complex so that one day it's actually going to crumble to the ground. I don't know if that's happening tomorrow, but one day, if it takes several generations from now to dismantle a system that took generations to build, okay, if that's the long horizon we're potentially working with, we'll just weaken the foundations until such time that it collapses on itself. And yeah, I think there's a lot of good insights and tools and examples in this book that help us understand how we could get there. I mean, it's in the title of the book, right? How to abolish prisons. In terms of your last question around what does a decarceral future and abolitionist future look like? Okay, well, I mean, I think I turn towards folks like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, her book Change Everything, even older works like Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis, where she talks about, or we already said this, about the prison being a panacea, right? Angela Davis also with Eduardo Mendieta have this book on abolition democracy that understands abolition as a dual process, borrowing from the work of W.E. Du Bois around, what is it that you're dismantling and what is it that you're building? So we're dismantling prisons, we're dismantling police, dismantling other parts of the carceral state, but at the same time, we need to build, right? And so what is it that we're not building when we decide to build cages? Well, we're neglecting or diverting resources from education, health and mental health, income supports. We're not looking into how can we address substance use in a better way, that kind of thing. So I think what we're talking about is, yes, building kinds of alternatives and investing upstream to try and prevent violence to the degree that's possible, and also put in place more transformative justice capacity to respond to it in a nonviolent and good way. But we're also, I think, talking about upending capitalism, upending colonialism, upending, white supremacy, upending ableism. And I could go through several isms that need to be upended, but I think you get my point. Basically, we need, and I don't have better words for it than Ruth Wilson Gilmore, than we need to change everything, So there's not like this kind of idea that you can abolish prison in this current context in which we are in. The current context needs to cease to exist as well. And that's a big, radical, revolutionary project. And capitalism and these other structures of oppression that we've talked about have proven to be incredibly resilient. I thought with COVID, where people had kind of at the beginning this ethic of considerable care for each other. I think lots of people made huge sacrifices, right? We made huge sacrifices in terms of agreeing to stay apart, of, trying to limit exposure to a disease that the thinking of at the time was could kill anyone. In that context, you had, well, at least in Canada, I don't know what was going on here. I think it was a bit different here from what I understand, but in Canada, you had income supports being put in place for a lot of people that were losing work. You had all kinds of different kinds of support programs that emerged. They've all been phased out to a large extent, but, there was a moment there where, the big box society in which we live, the one that tries to, encourage mass production and mass consumption, that was challenged in a serious way through COVID. And unfortunately, the system that we have, the ways that we structure our society, somehow rode it out and came out unscathed and, kind of back to quote unquote normal, That society that existed, one that predicated on economies of scale to extract as much profit as possible, made COVID worse, right? We're talking about bigger prisons, so there's bigger outbreaks, bigger factories, huge outbreaks, these are all things that should have been revisited to try and make our way of being, I don't know if resilience the word, but that we wouldn't be so vulnerable to death moving forward. Instead, it's the show's going on and, all these various kinds of disruptions that are having aren't leading to fundamental rethinking of our way of life. The wars, the climate catastrophes, nothing seems to push us towards thinking, hey, how are we organizing ourselves and we're relating to each other on a broad scale? And how is it contributing to these problems that are actually the planet's dying? Certainly the prison has a role in that. It helps maintain and entrench that. And yeah, we've got to figure out how to organize and save ourselves from ourselves. So yeah, in that light, maybe the book's useful in that regard too, but it's important to if one thing can be taken away from the book, not just think about abolition, but actually organize and do it.
Great. I think that's a nice place to wrap up the conversation. Lots of practical advice, I think, and lots of food for thought for our listeners as well. I really look forward to reading the book. So thank you so much for joining us, Justin.
Yeah, I appreciate this opportunity to share what Rachel Herzing and I did with the book. And thanks so much.